Challenger, Camaro, Mustang, iconic and surprisingly affordable cars for the past 60 years. But as we move into 2024, only one remains. Now yes, us car folks could argue about why the Challenger and the Camaro are gone, but really we have to focus on a bigger question. What's it like to live with the later generations of the one that started it all? Admittedly, today's exercise is going to be a bit challenging, see what I did there, but as the pace of change becomes increasingly faster in an SUV-crazed world, rather than starting at the beginning, let's take a look at how the great-great-great-grandson of the original pony car fits into 2024. So there's an old saying in the car world, if the top goes down, the price, it goes up. That's not entirely true. If the top goes down, the price and the weight go up. 3,933 pounds of defending express weights and measures 1,784 kilograms. With that, and a V8. Oh, that sounds. That's what a Mustang is about. And now they've morphed into what this car is. This is almost 500 horsepower. Really process that. Even if one is not into this type of a vehicle, for something that is related to affordable, one can have exotic car numbers, even in today's day and age, and it kind of works. I would argue with this transmission, it's not well suited. This is a vehicle that needs to be had in the manual transmission. I would argue you don't need 10 gears, and that's kind of the downfall. You have too much going on here, so the personality is lost in a Mustang. Then the overall driving dynamics, that's where, no, it's not a sophisticated vehicle. One doesn't buy these things thinking they're Porsches. The driving dynamics, not particularly precise. This one has the performance package, which means it's got the better brakes, the Brembo brakes, but these, they're not spongy. They're actually better than one thinks, but they're not exactly in line with how much power this car delivers. To answer the question of what it's like to live with a Mustang, we need to understand what generation of Mustang, because these have been around, believe it or not, for 60 years, broken into 7 different generations. And one of the dirty secrets about most generations of Mustangs, they're based on other more pedestrian cars, even the first generation. You could imagine the cars that are in huge volumes still on the road are cars like the last 3 or 4 generations. But then we get to some generations that really stand out, and for me it would be the S550. This was introduced about 10 years ago, and a couple of things happened here. Number one, this one, it grew in size quite a bit. Number two, I would argue the design, it made it a more international car. It no longer looked and screamed American. This almost had some European in its design, and because of that, I'm thinking Ford probably was planning ahead. They did make this first time for export markets, meaning a right-hand drive. Now this generation of Mustang also ushered in 3 different engine choices, the most groundbreaking, EcoBoost. Anyone that understands Ford lingo is thinking pickup trucks, maybe even Ford GT. Not exactly that flavor of EcoBoost, rather turbocharged 4-cylinder. Yes, we can get pedantic and say there was a very famous Turbo 4 in a Mustang that came many generations before this. We'll get to that generation. Now you're looking at this specific S550, and particularly the backdrop, and you're saying, what gives? That looks nothing like Florida. Well, I have a very personal relationship to this S550. This is my father's personal Mustang. To say that he is a Ford freak would be the understatement of the century. This is also special because it's a 50th anniversary. Stands out for a couple of reasons. Number one, only came as the GT. The trim was changed. Some of the detailing on the insides changed. They changed the windows in the back. So here, instead of regular glass, they have it separated so it looks like louvers from late 60s Mustangs. I'm not a louver fan, but I love that detail. Ford needs to be doing more of that. And then most importantly, they only made 1,964. This is 1,718 of that run. Even comes with a book that tells the history of Mustang, as well as this specific car. And this is where we have to bring up the bad news of the Challenger and the Camaro no longer existing. That S650 we're driving in Florida is very close closely related to this generation of Mustang, more so than other generational shifts in Mustang history. This is a very similar trick that Toyota pulled with a recent change in the Toyota Camry. You look at it, you think it's an entirely new car. It isn't. It was a very, very, very heavy refresh because programs like that don't have the same budgets that SUVs and crossovers do. Sports cars, even less. Unlike Stellantis or whatever they're calling themselves nowadays, and General Motors, Ford decided to make the investment in the Mustang, in this case, heavy, heavy refresh, to keep it alive. More important here than, say, a Toyota, because Ford has become a pickup truck company, a crossover company, an SUV company. So this is their only car that survives. Meet Barry, our return to the Fox Body era of Mustang in this little telenovela. Barry is the most basic Mustang you could have bought from a Ford dealer in 1990, meaning 4-cylinder automatic, yes, folding roof. Now, yeah, Barry really can't get out of his own way, but Barry has a hell of a story. Barry was purchased brand new by the proverbial little old lady. Yes, she drove it to church every Sunday. She drove this car for the rest of her life. Then she gifted the car to her next door neighbor's eldest daughter. Now, they were very close, more like a grandmother-granddaughter relationship. She drove the car for 2 years, then in turn gifted the car to her next oldest sister, who still drives this car 5 years later, all the way through school, has no intention of getting rid of Barry, even though her father, a good friend of mine, major car guy, has maybe bribed her with, hey, how about we get you a newer car, something to keep up with traffic, something different. I say to her, don't buy it, keep Barry. Don't give this car to your father. So Barry, it's kind of like the old adage in life, at least the car world. We don't buy a car, we buy a story. Step into the darkness, stare in the direction of where the sun sets. You and I need to have a discussion about money, far more important for a vehicle like this than any other car we cover in a round of the options game. Why? Because these are supposed to be affordable, and they still are. The most basic Mustang, which has a 4-cylinder engine, is $30,920. Very much in line with like a Miata, GR86, but you get more for the money. So you buy these things, I would argue, by the pound rather than the ounce. However, what you're looking at is a GT convertible. These are not as cheap. So yeah, it's a 480 horsepower car, so I don't expect it to be the most affordable car out there, but it's gone up in price, $51,980. Then the most important option this car is fitted with is the Performance Pack. Those of you that are Mustang fans know this adds a lot of things that make the car, I would say, credible. The biggest thing is the wheels, 19 inches. Notice I said 19 inches. These can be had with 20-inch wheels, but they're giving you some sidewall, which makes this a good tool for track days, autocross, because of the weight of the car. That also brings about more structural bracing, say that fast 5 times throughout the entire vehicle, a larger diameter rear sway bar, and then it changes the tune of the suspension. Now we have to press on to the matter of the parking brake. Yes, it's an electric parking brake. However, this package has this like handle thing. The idea is to drift. I'm not a huge fan of it. Maybe we can go back to a cable, which is cheaper, and take $500 off the $4,995 price of the performance package. Put it another way, about 10% of the base price of the vehicle. Then we're not done with the suspension. This has the Magna Ride, which is the adjustable dampers. Actually works somewhat okay. I'd want more adjustments, more settings, but that is $1,750. Then if one is buying a Mustang, one wants the car to sound obnoxious. I know I would. As such, I'd be glad to pay an extra $1,225 for the active valve exhaust. Then the only other thing we pay extra for is the destination and handling for $1,595. That's pretty steep, especially considering it's coming from the exotic port of call of Flat Rock, Michigan, which is where they have been made for a very long time. And that brings us to a total retail price of $66,535. As you and I drive down the stunning highways and byways of Deschutes County, Oregon, we have to have that discussion. The discussion about keeping one of these things on the road. Serviceability, maintenance. And here, none of you will be surprised, these are bulletproof because they have a couple of things going for them. Number one, they're a Ford. Whether you like Fords or not, they're reliable. Number two, this is about as basic of a car as one can have nowadays. This one, even 10 years old, is 4 wheels, brakes, and an engine. And at that, the engine is probably the most simple engine one can buy today. Even the fancy one we were driving in Florida, that car has a derivation of this very same engine. It is incredibly reliable. Now, culling from the data that we have, this car, probably a very bad example because it's been babied all its life. It's only had one owner. It's done a total of 5,000, yes, 5,000 original miles over a 10-year period. But this is not his first Mustang. He's had many. And then looking at other data points, like many friends of mine that had many Mustangs over the years, talking to Ford about maintenance issues with these cars, talking to some friends of mine at dealerships, as well as looking at the forums online, there really aren't issues with these going over many generations. But let's look at the new one. There are 3 things I was able to dig up. Number one, you're not going to be surprised, the screen. There's some problems with that big fancy screen. I believe they're addressing these through warranty as well as over-the-air updates. Then the brakes. Now, the car we drove in Florida, that when the brakes were kind of mushy, I think it's more a performance thing, the way they're envisioned or engineered. But from what I'm understanding, it's a bit more than that's being addressed by Ford. And then last but not least, wheel bearing issues. So if we're looking at these issues in the grand scheme of things, especially through the lens of modern day cars, probably one of the most bulletproof things to own. And it's here we got to put aside everything we just said, because not just Mustangs, but important cars like this have an opportunity to differentiate themselves, not just with interior design, but it's these details, going beyond what you can see, but how you feel, how you interact with the vehicle. It's those things that get generations of people excited about having many generations of these things over the years, because forget about maintenance, reliability, how much they cost. That's what it's like to be living with a car like this. That's what builds brands over 50, now 60 years. Okay, so let's put aside everything else we've discussed today and pose the most important question. Why is the Mustang still around? Answer, because it's affordable, but not in the way that you would think. And here we have some real data in which to cull from. This is the original window sticker for Barry. The base price was $15,199. With the options, it was $17,700. Now, that sounds very cheap, but in the grand scheme of things, nothing has really changed, because if you take $1990 and apply it to today, that would be about $36,000. The base price of a new Mustang convertible is $39,000. So you could account for significantly more horsepower for the 10% increase. Then we get into the real value of a car like this. You look at the cost of ownership here. This car in its entire life, with some damage to the door over here, $8,544. Every last penny spent on this car, aside from gas and insurance, for 34 years of ownership. I would say very affordable. But really we have to get back to what makes a car affordable, and that's who can buy it. So you look at cars like 911s, Corvettes, less people can buy them. Like, for example, a 1990 Corvette cost $32,000 base price. When you extrapolate out to today, that gets into the $80,000 car it is in 2024. We go back to 1990, the more powerful GT was about $22,000 in base price. So really, what am I getting at here? How much percentage-wise of the average income in any one of these decades did it take to buy a car like this? Back in 1990, it took 61%. In 2000, it took 64%. In 2010, it took 71%, and today, the S650 we are driving, that only considering the base price, forget about the crazy $67,000 base price of the car we're driving, 84% of the average income in the US. So one could say the affordability has changed based on the overall economic data and changes around the world, where the car, the price, has stayed pretty much static for the past 34 years. Now yes, we're not taking into account one of the largest costs of ownership of any car, no matter where it's made and what its purpose, and that is depreciation. The Ford, not quite the best out there. Let's take a look at other competitors like the Camaro and say a BMW M2, which cost about the same price as the vehicle we're driving in Florida. If we look at the ownership over a 5-year period, how much of its original sticker did it retain? Well, the Mustang was 45%. Believe it or not, the Camaro wasn't terrible at 53%. The BMW, now that's one of the biggest secrets in the car world. People think BMWs have really good resale. They don't, because they lease so many. But M cars do have good resale, and there the M2 is the champ of this whole shootout. 63% retained value over 5 years. But all that aside, there's a hell of a lot of learning getting behind the wheel of Barry. Number one, this is a very small car. Like in comparison to that S650 you and I are driving, this is 7 inches shorter. Now yeah, one could argue cars back then, no matter the size, they were all smaller. Now 7 inches doesn't sound like a huge difference, but in today's day and age, that's the difference between an E-Class, a 5 Series, and an S-Class. Now let's say for the sake of discussion, we chalk all of that up to generational differences. It applies to every car, which it does. Something we can't. You look at this, Barry in 1990, and look at its contemporaries, specifically from like Japan and Germany, and they were light years ahead of any Mustang. For example, you look at something like a Z, a Super, or even lesser, a 240SX, that was an orders of magnitude better car than this back in 1990. However, today that doesn't really apply. The Ford Mustang, not the best car out there, but that delta between its competitors, even more expensive competitors, with the exception of the interior, is much smaller, which means Ford has made huge strides in imagining, engineering, and executing better cars that, wait for it, are far more competitive in the overall landscape. So putting it all together, why is this, out of all the affordable performance, muscle cars, GT cars built over the past 50, 60 years, the last man standing? To answer that, we have to look across to the world of fast food. Now be honest, when was the last time you as an adult, not as an 8-year-old looking for a Happy Meal, was excited to go to McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's? Now why is that? Many years ago, all those companies started and they were good at one thing. Then they got successful and they wanted to grow, so they added things like chicken and hot dogs and breakfast. And people, they got less excited and they decided to go less only when the Rugrats started screaming about it. But then on the flip side of the coin, there are places like In-N-Out Burger. There's one pretty much every corner of the world. Maybe they're not called In-N-Out Burger, but at least here we have this magnificent place that started making these burgers in the late 40s, and they haven't changed. That's all you can get there. Yeah, they have a secret menu where things get exciting, but for the most part, no chicken, no hot dogs, no breakfast. Just a burger that is done right, that is affordable. So, what you are looking at here is the In-N-Out Burger on 4 wheels.